I love experimental fiction. I love a book that's going its own way, doing its own thing, venturing into the wild unknown, or just plain weird. And I have a pretty massive TBR, to which I have been adding, over the months and years, more and more little gems, either widely known or barely talked about, that are known to be a little bit strange. And for this reading vlog, I thought it might be fun to pull a few of those out of the hat and give them a try, see what I think. Do I believe they truly belong on lists recommending great experimental fiction or weird lit, or are they a little too conventional for that categorization? So in this video, I'm gonna listen to 3 audiobooks from my experimental fiction weird lit TBR and take you along with me as I dive into them and see just how weird we can get. I am, as you all know, a huge audiobook lover. I listen to audiobooks every single day of my life and have since I was a young child. And because I love audiobooks, I'm so glad to say that Spotify is kindly sponsoring this video. With a Spotify premium account, you can listen to 15 hours of any audiobook from their premium catalog, which is extensive. But if you want to listen to even more than 15 hours, there are options. There's Audiobook Plus, which is an add-on to your monthly subscription and doubles your listening hours per month. You can also purchase additional top-ups for your listening time, which are only used when you run out of your allotted 15 hours or 30 hours a month, depending on your plan. Your audiobook top-ups stay available in your account for 12 months before they expire, so you can dip into them whenever you need to finish that book. So far, pretty much any book I have searched for on Spotify has been available in audiobook form, including the books in this video, which are, by their very definition, a little bit off the beaten track. I love the convenience of being able to switch back and forth between the audiobook I'm currently listening to and the song that I cannot get out of my head no matter what I do, all in one app with one convenient monthly subscription. So try Spotify today, get Spotify Premium to listen to audiobooks every single month. Without further ado, let's talk about the first book that I'm going to read for this video, which is from one of the kings of weird stories, Stephen King himself. I have a whole reading vlog where I dive into Stephen King's oeuvre and read quite a few of his short stories and full-length novels, which you can check out. I'll link it in the cards and the description box. But today I'm going to be checking out one of his apparently most experimental books, at least in terms of structure, and that is The Life of Chuck. Stephen King writes a lot of weird books, okay, as I am well aware, but this one particularly stands out because the entire story is told in reverse, which is a pretty fun gimmick, and I guess we'll just have to see if it pays off in the storytelling. I have found Stephen King's work to be very hit or miss for me. Some of his short stories and novels I absolutely love and am much more emotionally impacted and touched than I expected to be, or weirded out, or creeped out, or terrified, whatever the case may be. But he also has written some short stories and some novels that definitely miss the mark for me. So it's always a little bit of a gamble with his stuff, but I just can't help but be intrigued by the idea of reading a story told in reverse. You'd think that more authors would play with form in this way, but I just feel like most of them don't bother. This one's a pretty quick listen, coming in at 2.5 hours at regular speed. And as I get started, feel free to let me know in the comments your favorite pieces of experimental fiction or weird lit, so I can, like a dragon collecting treasure, add them all to my TBR list and have even more of these to dive into when the mood strikes. Thanks in advance. Okay, let's get into The Life of Chuck. Okay, so I finished The Life of Chuck last night, and after I finished it and I let it process for a second and I wrote down my thoughts. I then went to the internet to see what other people said about it, other theories, opinions, and quickly learned that there was a movie that came out in 2024, an adaptation. So I figured out how we could watch it, and when my husband got home from work, I semi-forced him to watch it with me. I didn't really have to force him to watch it with me. He's usually very on board with us watching film or TV adaptations of the books that I read. We've done it for so many at this point. Silo, the original Beauty and the Beast, Pride and Prejudice. We're working our way through the North and South miniseries, and now The Life of Chuck. And pretty much every time I tell him, okay, so I just read this great book and there's an adaptation. He knows what we're in for, and he's a good sport. So we watched it last night and oh my God, my mind is blown. This is going to be a review of the book and specifically the audiobook, of course, but I will just say before I get into my review that if you ever watch movies, I would definitely recommend this film. I thought it was amazing. And as much as I really enjoyed this short story, and I did, spoiler alert, I think I enjoyed the film even more. There was just something about being able to see the characters and see all their subtle facial expressions and all of the little hints that appear unrecognized and unmentioned ahead of time that you can start to pick up on something happening before you fully realize that there's a bit of a sci-fi or speculative element to it. Incredible, impeccable, outstanding acting in the film. My God. Just fantastic. So anyway, if this story sounds at all interesting to you, please go watch the film and also read the short story, but then go watch the film. I'd probably read the story first. To be honest, I didn't feel like it took anything away from the film to have read it first, but I mean, your mileage may vary, do whatever you want, but just wanted to say that because we did also watch the film last night. So anyway, all that to say, this story, The Life of Chuck by Stephen King, was awesome. I agree that it is experimental. It is told in reverse, and that is experimental. It goes, Act 3, Act 2, Act 1, telling the last third of the story, then the middle, and then the first third of the story. And I definitely felt like the reverse structure added to the story in a couple ways. You're watching the story of someone's life in reverse and you know how it ends, and we know how it ends for all of us, and knowing how it ends and when it ends for him just added this undercurrent of melancholy through the entire story, but also this sense of immediacy of not only for us knowing how it ends for Chuck, but also because of the sci-fi or speculative element, Chuck also has a bit of an inkling of how it's going to end for him as well. But I would say, as much as it does add a little bit of that tension or melancholy to the story because we know how things will end and when for him, you also get this sense, or at least I did, of poignancy and immediacy and really reinforcing the beauty of life and of relationships and of living your life to the fullest, of choosing to live in the present, even knowing, as we all do, that we will eventually die. And instead of living in fear of that day, choosing to live in the moment and to enjoy your life and let yourself be wonderful, as Chuck says, as a child. And I just found it really heartwarming. And this really did end up being another one of Stephen King's short stories that very little to no horror element. I would say actually the film adaptation kind of played up the one element of this story that could be considered even horror adjacent, but still not that much, I would say. But it really is the story of one man's life and recognizing the fleeting quality of it and recognizing the beauty and those moments that stick with you for your whole life, the moments that sparkle in your memory. And I'm going to get emotional, but even when your memories start to fade, there are those moments that are shining beacons of light that represent your joie de vivre and represent who you were in the world and your impact on the world. And there's also an element here of exploring what human consciousness means. And I also felt that this theme was explored in a really interesting way using this reverse storytelling. I don't want to say too much in the non-spoiler section because I don't want to give anything away, but working off of the Walt Whitman quote, "I contain multitudes," and the way that that phrase sort of stuck in Chuck's brain as a kid in English class, and the way he interpreted it and the way it shaped his life moving forward. And then the story kind of incorporates that concept into the larger narrative and into the world of the story in a really interesting way. Kind of gets a little cosmic and metaphysical there, which was great. I think my favorite Stephen King is my sentimental, aware of his own mortality, heartwarming, but also slightly weird version of him. I feel like a lot of the stories in the last short story collection of his that I read that came out this year, I think it was You Like It Darker, which I really loved. A lot of my favorite stories in this collection, and really the collection as a whole, was kind of meditating on mortality in a similar way, I would say, to The Life of Chuck. I feel like The Life of Chuck would have fit perfectly into that collection, although I think it came out in the previous short story collection. Anyway, I really liked this, and I've waffled a little bit back and forth, but I think I'm going to give it 5 stars, to be honest. The narration was great. I was totally drawn in. It's quite short, but very immersive, and I was totally invested. Chuck is a very endearing protagonist, and I think even more so in some ways that you watch his life backwards and you get to learn about him first from other people's perspectives of him, his impact on the world, his impact on other people, both strangers and loved ones. And then moving in reverse, you get to know him more and more until we see how he became the Chuck that he became and those formative childhood experiences that built him. I really enjoyed this a lot. So I'm going to give The Life of Chuck 5 stars. I really loved listening to it. It's available on Spotify Premium if you want to give it a listen. It's a very quick, easy listen, so I would recommend, and then also go watch the movie because it's great. Yeah, themes of memory, how we conceptualize the world, how we understand human consciousness, the power of the human mind, and recognizing the extraordinary in the ordinary every day and allowing those moments to live with you, noticing the small things, stopping to smell the flowers, recognizing the simple joys, and also allowing yourself to feed your inner child and be spontaneous and grab life by the horns. Chuck was just the most normal guy, perhaps even by some standards, the most boring normal guy, but he was also the most important person in the universe, depending on your perspective. And that's kind of the case for every person. We are all the most important person in our own little universe, in our version of the universe, and also the most important person to the people who love us and the people whose lives we've touched and changed by just existing, which is kind of nice. Okay, so all my other notes are touching on spoilery things, so I'll share them in a spoiler section. But first, I want to share my one possible criticism if I were to have one, and then I want to share my favorite quote and also possibly, depending on your perspective, the most important quote of this short story. So my one point of constructive criticism would maybe be breaking it up into more sections would have allowed it to be told even more so in reverse, because it was told in 3 sections, and those 3 sections, you take your standard 3-act story structure and you just flip 1 and 3, but each of the acts are told in chronological order. I think breaking it into smaller sections and telling each of those in chronological order, but them all being in reverse, would have really amplified that feeling of the story being told backwards and possibly reinforced the themes even more, depending on how it was executed, of course. Okay, and then my favorite quote, and possibly the most important quote of the entire short story, which was, "I am wonderful, I deserve to be wonderful, and I contain multitudes." Okay, spoilers for The Life of Chuck. Skip this if you're going to read this short story and or watch the film. I would recommend both. So if you haven't read it yet, you should be skipping this section. Use the chapters to just jump right to the end, or mute me and wait till the frame disappears. Either or. Spoilers starting now. Okay, so as you know, because you've read this, right? You've read it. That's why you're watching the spoiler section. Right, okay. First, we're introduced to Marty, who's a school teacher, and he's dealing with lots of stressed out parents at a parent-teacher night because the world seems to be ending. The climate crisis is escalating. Huge swaths of California have crumbled off into the ocean, and also the internet seems to be going down. And he's trying to talk to the parents about their kids, and the parents are just dumping on him like he's their therapist and asking him to process the trauma for them, which is not his job. And then on his way home, he sees a big billboard that is a picture of Chuck, and it says, "Thanks, Chuck, for 39 great years." And he thinks, who is this guy and who's paying for a billboard to celebrate someone's retirement when it's the end times. And then as things progress in this first act or third act, there are more and more instances of this Chuck Krantz popping up. He's on TV, he's on the radio, benches, and on posters, and just it's escalating. Chuck Krantz is everywhere. And no one knows who he is. No one knows why this is happening. And then we eventually get to Chuck in a hospital bed, and he's dying from brain cancer. And his wife and his son are there. And we get a moment where he is nearing the end. And his wife says, "Thanks, Chuck, for 39 great years." Sorry. Which, getting emotional, and we realize that that's where the poster came from, which is a little, trippy and mind-bending. And he passes away, and when he dies, the universe ends. Stars and planets wink out of existence, and then everything is just over. And then we get into the middle of his life and learn more about Chuck. And we see how he came to this point. We see what his life was like. And he was an accountant. He took after his grandfather, who was an accountant, and lived a relatively boring, standard day-to-day life. But he also took time and took moments in his life to feel joy and to be spontaneous. And then we continue on, we learn more about his life in reverse, and we learn that he lost his parents when he was very young and moved in with his grandparents. And in their Victorian home, there was a cupola that was locked up at the top, and his grandfather wouldn't let him in it because he had seen a vision of a child in the neighborhood's death, and then it came true. And then he saw a vision of his wife's death, and he was living in this fear and anticipation and, terror of when his wife, Chuck's grandmother, would pass because he saw this vision. And one night, Chuck goes up and he sees his own death. He sees himself in a hospital bed as a not too old man, very close to the end. And he doesn't say as much, but it seems like he sort of makes a decision in that moment that he is going to choose life and not going to spend his life in fear and letting the terror of the waiting overcome him the way it seemed to do for his grandfather, who was an alcoholic and suffered greatly from the loss of his child and their spouse, but also of this fear and anticipation of his wife's death. Some of my favorite passages as well were Chuck in the after-school dance program and learning to dance and loving dance, and that comes up again in the middle portion where he's an adult, he's at a conference, and he's walking by, and there's this busker playing the drums, and he just feels the beat come over him and he has to dance, and he ends up dancing on the street, and another woman is there and they start dancing together, and it's just this joyful, exuberant celebration of life and movement. And really, it makes me think of in theater school talking about musicals and talking about the logic of a musical, because a lot of people feel like musicals make no sense. This is a sidetrack, but it makes sense. It connects back. Okay, don't worry. But a lot of people feel that musicals are silly and don't make sense because who breaks out into song and dance randomly? Chuck does, first of all. But also, the whole point of a musical is that, at least a well-written, a well-structured musical, is that the idea that breaking into song and dance happens in the moments where your emotion has become so big that you can no longer control it. You can no longer contain it within dialogue. You feel your emotion so strongly that you have to sing about it, and or you have to dance about it, that your life force is just bubbling so intensely under the surface that you have to let it out. And that's what a great musical does, whether it's from joy or falling in love or heartbreak or grief, whatever, the huge feeling is, those feelings push the characters to burst into song or break into dance. And it felt like Chuck was living that in his life, that he was allowing himself to feel those big emotions even as an adult. And I think a lot of adults start to feel like they have to contain their, big bursts of emotion, that it's childish to have these big emotions or to just break into dance or to break into song because you feel things and you want to be joyful or be sad or be whatever. And Chuck allowed himself a moment in his humdrum everyday life to just dance because the music moved him and he felt it and he needed to, and I love that. So anyway, but one of the things that I find really interesting about the story outside of just the heartwarming nature of his life story, and Chuck being a very endearing character, and, you know, loving this message of living your life, even if it's a very ordinary life, to its fullest, and loving it and loving the people in your life and embracing spontaneous moments of joy. He says in the final part, "I am wonderful. I deserve to be wonderful. I contain multitudes." And the multitudes and the human consciousness concept is the speculative element of this that really takes everything to a whole other level, because, like I said, at the end of the first act, the world ends, presumably, seemingly. And as we go through, we realize that the people we meet in the first act, the places we go, the things we see are all moments and memories and people that Chuck knew in his life. And we come to realize as we get all the way to the end, to the beginning of his life, he had an English teacher who introduced him to this concept of "I contain multitudes," Walt Whitman, and explained it to him as, you have the entire universe in your mind. You hold the entire world in your mind. Everyone you've ever met, anyone you ever could meet, everyone you could ever imagine, every place, person, and thing exists in your mind, and your mind is creating your own universe. You contain multitudes, you contain everything. And he just loves this idea. He's so taken by it. And that plays out in the story. And whether you believe it's literal, where the entire universe exists within his mind, or whether this is the universe made up of his experiences, his memories, all the things that made him who he was, and all the experiences he had in his life that created its own reality, essentially, and that reality, his consciousness, is winking out of existence because he's passing away. And that this is just a representation of what a human mind does and is, that our consciousness, our mind, builds an entire universe for us to exist within, an entire reality. And I think in the film it's a little bit clearer that this is kind of the concept, and not so much that the entire world is ending because of him dying, but that this specific version of the world that seems to really just be what his mind is going through, what his mind is creating in his last days or weeks or months as his mind deteriorates from brain cancer. Because in the film it's much more clear that things are happening in places that he's been, and every single character is someone that he saw once or talked to once. And I also saw a theory online, someone sharing that they felt the story was about Stephen King himself, and that Chuck represents Stephen King. And I think that's a really interesting idea, not only because, like I said, You Like It Darker short story collection that I recently read, so much of it was about wrestling with your own mortality, and it does feel like Stephen King, now being in his 70s, is facing that and is reckoning with that. But this story, especially with this idea of your mind containing multitudes and containing universes, feels very apt for an author, someone who creates characters and worlds for a living. I imagine Stephen King's mind contains multitudes, literally universe after universe after universe of stories and characters and events and possibilities. And he's published so many of them, but I'm sure there are so many that are just lurking in, the pathways of his mind. And when he passes, those will disappear as well. And while he has a legacy and he's written so many of his stories down and they will live on in our memories and our ability to read them, there are still going to be so many stories and ideas and characters, and also just all of his own memories and lived experiences that exist solely in his mind and will cease to exist. So I thought that was a really interesting, sort of morbid and sad, but also really interesting and probably a fair or realistic interpretation based on my conceptualization of Stephen King and where he's at with mortality right now from reading some of his other work. I just kind of loved this, and I definitely lean on the side of thinking that this is his own consciousness and a representation of his consciousness ending as he passes away, and just trying to be a representation of what it would mean for our minds to contain multitudes, to contain universes and realities. And also, tying in with something that I've heard a lot in the last couple months since losing my dad, which is this idea that people live on in your memories, which is great and helps a lot when you're grieving, or, depending on the person and how you're feeling, it can help more or less depending on the day. But it has helped me a lot to think that my dad lives on in my memories of him and in my love of him. But then when you start to think about your own mortality, I start to freak out a bit about all the things about my dad that are living on in me, that when I am gone someday, those memories will also be gone. Yeah, there's an element of that as well with Chuck and with his grandparents and some of his memories of his grandparents, and this idea that they're gone, but he remembers all these little moments with them and the joy that they brought him and the love and the home that they gave him, but that when he passes, those memories are gone as well, and those, remaining scraps of who they were are disappearing as well. And eventually, you get to a point where no one alive remembers someone. And then at that point, are they gone for good? Sorry, this just got really dark and depressing. But anyway, just lots to think about, lots to chew on, and I just thought it was really beautiful. And like I said, the film, if you've read the short story but haven't seen the film yet, I would highly recommend it. The acting is just so fantastic. It just really brings all of the emotion and all of those layers forward even more. It was really fantastically done, and a very faithful interpretation with a lot of just direct quotes, direct lines pulled from the book, which was awesome. So anyway, cosmic horror, but not wholesome story about one man choosing his life to the fullest, but also the apocalypse, a little bit of existential dread. So that's it for spoilers. Those are all my thoughts for The Life of Chuck, and I'm gonna give this 5 stars. This really very pleasantly surprised me, and I have a feeling that I'm gonna be thinking about this story a lot moving forward. It really has planted a seed in my brain, I think, in terms of conceptualization of our own human consciousness, but also it was just a really heartwarming story. And in some ways it feels like it's helped me a little bit with processing my grief, which is a really nice side effect that I didn't expect. So I would highly recommend it. Check it out if you're interested. If you haven't tried any Stephen King, because you're not a horror person, this is 0% horror. There's nothing scary about it except for, the terror of facing our own mortality, I guess, but it's not scary. And the film isn't scary either. So that is our first pick done for our experimental fiction reading vlog, which means it's time to move on to our second book, The Waves by Virginia Woolf. I have actually not read any Virginia Woolf before, which is kind of wild because she is, of course, incredibly famous and beloved and respected as an author. Many of her books are considered classics. And The Waves seems to be, although I hadn't heard about it until more recently, is considered by many to be her best work and also her most experimental. This is a story that focuses on 6 characters, 6 friends, and the narrative is very much stream of consciousness, trading points of view, soliloquies of the characters, and it is very strange. And this is unintentional, but here we are. This is another story about grief. And I actually started this morning and was so taken by it and immediately drawn in that I listened to the halfway point as I was getting ready to film this update. So I'm actually already at the 50% mark of The Waves. And to be honest, I'm not sure how much I can say because this is weird. Okay, it's very strange. It really is told in this. The Waves is a very apt title because the narrative feels like it's just waves and waves of ideas and feelings and thoughts. One wave comes up on the shore, is one point of view from one of the characters, and as soon as it recedes, another one is coming right at you again, and this is another character and all of their messy emotions and thoughts and feelings. It's very full force, kind of overwhelming, kind of hard to process and follow and take in, but it is very beautifully written. It's evocative. There are some absolutely gorgeous passages, some really descriptive passages, and a lot of emotion and very much a clear sense of who each of these 6 characters are and what their relationships are like to each other, to the world, how they feel about themselves and other people. Like I said, I started it this morning and I just couldn't stop listening to it. It's very propulsive and immersive. Kind of feels like getting pulled out to sea by Riptide and you're along for the ride. What else are you gonna do? Just very sudden and strong currents. That's kind of what this feels like. And it's very interesting. I don't know how I'll feel about it once I finish it. I guess it'll depend on how the characters and the themes develop and whether the structure stays consistent all the way through or shifts at any point. There's a lot of different things it could do in the second half. I'll certainly say that it's interesting. It's definitely experimental for sure, very much belongs in this video, and feels like a pretty wild introduction to Virginia Woolf. I guess because people say this is her most experimental work, that everything else she wrote is going to feel much more normal and conventional after this, but who knows? I am curious to read some of her other famous works. I mean, I already was. They were already on my TBR, but now even more so because this is delightfully strange. And yeah, we'll see where it goes. Like I said, some really beautiful lines. Maybe I'll read a couple for you so you get a sense of the writing style. We just started getting into the grief, and there was already a quote that really resonated with me and that I thought was beautiful, and a beautiful representation of that early, incredibly painful stage of grief, the shock of the loss. "Come, pain, feed on me, bury your fangs in my flesh, tear me asunder, I sob, I sob." "It is Percival," says Lewis, "sitting silent as he sat among their tickling grasses when the breeze parted the clouds and they formed again, who makes us aware that these attempts to say, 'I am this, I am that,' which we make, coming together like separated parts of one body and soul, are false. Something has been left out from fear. Something has been altered from vanity. We have tried to accentuate differences. From the desire to be separate, we have laid stress upon our faults and what is particular to us. But heat and cold will follow each other naturally without my willing or unwilling. My children will carry me on. Their teething, their crying, their going to school and coming back will be like the waves of the sea under me. No day will be without its movement. I shall be lifted higher than any of you on the backs of the seasons. What I say is perpetually contradicted. Each time the door opens, I am interrupted. I am not yet 21. I am to be broken. I am to be derided all my life. I am to be cast up and down among these men and women with their twitching faces, with their lying tongues, like a cork on a rough sea. Like a ribbon of weed, I am flung far every time the door opens. I am the foam that sweeps and fills the uttermost rims of the rocks with whiteness. I am also a girl, here, in this room." Gorgeous. It's so gorgeous. "Rich and heavy sensations form on the roof of my mind. Down showers the day, the woods, and Elveden, Susan and the pigeon, pouring down the walls of my mind, running together. The day falls copious, resplendent. Now I tie my pajamas loosely round me and lie under this thin sheet afloat in the shallow light, which is like a film of water drawn over my eyes by a wave. I hear through it far off, far away, faint and far, the chorus beginning, wheels, dogs, men shouting, church bells, the chorus beginning. Now I spread my body on this frail mattress and hang suspended. I am above the earth now. I am no longer upright to be knocked against and damaged. All is soft and bending." Anyway, those are just a couple examples of the writing style. It's absolutely gorgeous, but it's also this constant, very much fitting of the imagery of waves just constantly flowing and moving, but also just, you never get a break, you never get a pause. They just come wash over you again and again and again. And at first, I actually read the first 50 pages or so and just felt like, what? And I decided to start again. And I started listening much slower than I typically would listen, really trying to take in every single sentence. And I'm glad I did that, and I have continued to listen to it much slower than I typically would. But also, I quickly realized that you just can't, or at least I just can't, actually take in every single idea and sort of stop and consider it. There's just too much. It's too overwhelming. And I actually found that I fell into the rhythm more, and I felt I understood the characters and what was happening and their feelings more when I just let go and let myself flow with it and notice the things that popped out to me versus trying to really dig into every single sentence in the way that I normally would. Normally when I read a book, I want to understand every single sentence and every idea and process it. And normally I can do that at a pretty rapid rate. I'm able to read and comprehend pretty quickly. But with this, I just had to let go a little bit and let it wash over me. And I think that's working better. And I assume, from my own perspective reading this, that was kind of the intention, because it is a lot and it's full force and it's never ending and kind of overwhelming. But it's also beautiful, and so far I'm enjoying it as much as it's very strange. So all that to say, who knows where this is going to go and how I'm going to feel at the end, but it's very interesting so far. And I'm excited to see what Woolf does with it. So I'll be back when I'm done to share my final thoughts. Hey friends! So I finished The Waves by Virginia Woolf last night, but then I kind of felt like my brain broke. So I decided to just kind of leave it, sleep on it, let my subconscious mind process it a little bit, percolate. And then this morning, as I was getting ready, having my morning coffee, I re-listened to the last half hour or so to just take it in one more time. And while I still kind of feel like I'm gonna have to reread this at some point to fully absorb it, I do think that that helped. So I'm glad I did that instead of trying to share my final thoughts last night. I think it would have been a garbled mess. So how does one even talk about The Waves by Virginia Woolf? I don't know. This was my first foray into Woolf's writing, and my understanding is that she is pretty well known for this stream of consciousness style, but even though that is generally her style, that The Waves is the most experimental of her work and kind of takes it the furthest with this interspersing of different characters, inner monologues, these soliloquies, and almost approached more as poetry or as a play or some combination thereof rather than a novel, which I did a little bit of research this morning and saw some quotes from Woolf talking about her experience of writing the novel and some of her perspective, and it does seem like she approached it from more of a dramatic place as if she were a playwright. And I definitely picked up on that. It felt very familiar for that reason because I did go to theater school. So I've read a lot of plays in my life, and I think my very first note in my Notion reading tracker is, after saying very strange, and the prose at the beginning is very evocative, descriptive, and beautiful, was almost feels like an experimental play. So definitely felt that way. Definitely felt like a play with 6 characters, and every time we switch between one and the other, there's just a spotlight, everything else goes dark, and it's just a character in a black void, speaking to the audience, sharing their stream of consciousness, ever-changing, ever-evolving, sort of chaotic thoughts. And then they go dark and another spotlight lights up and it's another character. And then they sort of take on the narrative with a few moments of either, now I'm getting into my director mind, it kind of felt like the interludes in italics that were from a separate perspective would have been either a choral voice of all 6 speaking together in unison to impart that, or maybe a voiceover, you know, a bodiless, formless voice just booming through the space. Anyway, it was really interesting. In reading it, it felt very much like a play, and I found myself kind of experiencing it as I would experience a play when you're reading a play, and envisioning the staging and envisioning the acting choices of the various characters, and kind of thinking about how I would interpret each character if I were to play them on stage, thinking about their motivations and their impetus to speak in each passage and what the subtext is underneath what they're actually saying. So that was really interesting for me, and I liked it a lot for that reason. It felt very comforting and familiar. There was something really unique about this, of course, but also something really special and profound about it. I mean, the first layer is just that it's gorgeously written. The prose is next level stunning. I ended up getting a copy of the ebook from my library so that I could pull exact quotes, because as I was listening, there were so many moments that I was just thinking, that's stunning. And I was taking notes saying, quote when Rhoda says this, quote when Neville says this at this % through. And then as I kept going and I kept having more and more and more of those, usually if I only have a handful of quotes that really jump out to me, I'll just replay them a few times and transcribe it myself. But in this case, there were just so many and they were so long, such long passages, that I'm glad I was able to get the ebook from my library and just copy those, because it would have taken me years, I imagine, to transcribe all of these quotes that I loved. Just stunning, stunning writing, and it makes me very excited to read more of Virginia Woolf's work. Of course, I was under the impression that her work was beautiful, and that was part of why she was so well respected and why her works have really stood the test of time, but I was pretty bowled over and blown away by just how stunning the prose was. I want someone to sit beside me after the day's pursuit and all its anguish, after its listenings and its waitings and its suspicions. After quarreling and reconciliation, I need privacy, to be alone with you, to set this hubbub in order. I just love that. I also love the idea of needing privacy to be alone with you, which is something I feel with really only one person in my life, my partner, my husband. This idea of feeling like you can be alone with someone else because they are so in tune with you. The lines that define you or separate you are so fuzzy and amorphous that in some ways they feel like another part of you, like that, when you get into the poetry of love and this idea of you complete me or you are my other half. And I think that that's an idea that comes up so much, not just because it's a cliche way to express your love, but because it really can feel when you find your person that your puzzle pieces clicking together and all of a sudden you are more. It's not that they, colonize half of your existence or something and you're now less of a whole person than you were before, but that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and that you both expand into this new version of existence where you both contribute to this new form of life that is a combination. I don't know if any of that made sense, but that's what that quote made me think of, and it's something that I felt very keenly in the last 11 years or so of being with my partner. Among the tortures and devastations of life is this then: our friends are not able to finish their stories. With their addition, I am Bernard, I am Byron, I am this, that, and the other. They darken the air and enrich me as of old with their antics, their comments, and cloud the fine simplicity of my moment of emotion. For I am more selves than Neville thinks. We are not simply as our friends would have us to meet their needs. Yet love is simple. And I love that too, this idea that we are so many things. We contain multitudes, pulling it back, bringing it back to the life of Chuck. But this idea that we are not simple. A human is so layered, so complex. We have so many selves that we present at different times and around different people, but we are all of them. And this idea that you can be this many-faceted person, you can contain multitudes, but in your relationships, in your friendships, they may see you as one version of yourself, but that it can be quite challenging to find a friend, to find friendships that encompass all of those aspects of yourselves. And I think a lot of us have had the experience of maybe finding a few, a handful or less, maybe even only one person who can appreciate and love every facet of us. This book has been out for a long time. There are a lot of theories of what it means and what she's trying to say. I guess I'll save for the spoiler section my interpretation or the theory that I most align with, but I would say that this really is examining identity and belonging, individuality versus conformity or multiplicity, containing multitudes. Again, this feels like a very, maybe unexpected, yet a very fitting pairing with The Life of Chuck, which is awesome. I feel like reading The Life of Chuck first kind of opened my mind to some other possibilities, and in reading this, it made me much more aware of and open to interpreting these characters and their lives and Virginia Woolf's intention with the novel a little bit more easily or more readily, I guess. The prose, as I said, is gorgeous, but it also has this almost hypnotic quality to it, which I talked about in the first half. I would say that continued while the characters, as they age, their soliloquies lengthen and become a little bit more focused and a little less frantic and chaotic. There's still this sense of a stream of consciousness, ideas popping up as they do and kind of going on tangents, and the writing is quite complex and intricate, and that makes it maybe for some people, and for me definitely at points, a little impenetrable, but absolutely gorgeous. And I do think I was on the right track when I kind of let go a little bit and let it just wash over me like waves on the shore. I think that that was the intention, and obviously fits with the imagery of these interspersed descriptions of waves on the ocean coming into the shore, the sun rising and setting, and, you know, highlighting the crests of the waves and all of that. I think it's, you know, a larger metaphor for life, but also for identity and consciousness and our existence and our connection with those around us. But I do find this a little hard to talk about. I will 100% have to reread this in the future. I did love listening to it as an audiobook. I think that really enhances that wave-like, incessant, flowing, rhythmic, hypnotic quality. You really do kind of feel yourself, or at least I did, felt myself being pulled into a trance by the narration, which was awesome. I do think in the future, I would definitely listen to the audiobook simultaneously because I loved the audiobook experience, but I think in the future I would get a physical copy, maybe highlight with a different color for each of the 6 characters to be able to kind of follow each one, because I think after one more reread of it in its entirety as intended, both reading with my eyes and listening to the audiobook, it would be interesting to do a third reread of one character at a time. So reading every Neville bit, reading every Rhoda bit, reading every Bernard bit, etc., to try to get a full picture of one character at a time, kind of separated from the whole. So I'm probably going to try that at some point. No idea when, because my TBR is ever growing and gigantic. There's only so much time in a day. But this is such an interesting work, and I would love to kind of tease it apart more, so I think I probably will do that in the future. Maybe I'll try to convince either the buddy read or the book club on Patreon to read it with me so that I have excuses to reread it a couple times and dive into it a little bit more. Then maybe I'll feel a little bit less like I'm taking time away from other books that I could be reading. But I would highly recommend this. I thought it was really intriguing and immersive and engrossing and very touching and moving and beautiful at points. I'd be really curious if you've read The Waves, your interpretation of it, what you thought of it, also your favorite character or the character you felt most akin to, who you related to the most. I would say when they were children, I related most to Rhoda. And then when they were adults, I guess some sort of a combination of still Rhoda quite a bit, but less so as time went on. In young adulthood, still very much so Rhoda, but as she aged, I think, you know, our experiences diverged. But also in some ways, Susan, as much as Susan is sort of the picture of domesticity and motherhood and sort of traditional femininity, and in many ways I don't relate to that, there is something about her love of home and comfort and nature and family and the quiet day-to-day moments, and also her, you know, moments here and there of her feeling like maybe she wasted her life somehow by choosing something much more quiet and domestic and peaceful. Like maybe there were exciting opportunities to be had that she didn't take because she chose this path instead. And I think there were aspects of her choices in life and her priorities, and also the way she thought about her life and some of her regrets or just her conflicted feelings about the path she chose that I could really relate to, even though I'm not a mother. I think I'll hop into a spoiler section for The Waves by Virginia Woolf. So spoilers now. Don't watch this if you're going to read this, please. This is such an interesting and unique book that I think it's worth giving it a try, even if it doesn't necessarily sound up your alley. Maybe just give it a go and see what you think. If it doesn't work for you, you know, that's okay. But I personally would recommend giving it a go and also not watching the spoilers if you're planning on reading it. But spoilers for The Waves. So, okay, I'll start with saying that Rhoda eventually completes suicide. And for this reason, a lot of people feel that Rhoda is sort of a stand-in for Woolf herself, because she also ended up completing suicide, I believe, about a decade after completing The Waves. And there is something even more weighty and impactful about reading this character who gets so deep into her mind, and especially because she was the one I related to most, I really felt very connected to Rhoda. And then the way the narrative tells us that she has passed away and that it was by her own hand is in a pretty dispassionate way through Bernard. And we don't get to see those final moments or what really drove her to that choice. And it feels very jarring and sudden, which I think is appropriate for what loving someone and losing someone to suicide can feel like for those around them. But I think there's that extra layer because Virginia Woolf herself was someone who suffered from depression and suicidality and mental illness throughout her life, and that she ended up making that same choice, that there's something so much more devastating about her choosing that for Rhoda as well, and wondering if some of how Rhoda felt through her life also is how Virginia Woolf herself might have felt. Just very emotional and heartbreaking and devastating to read. The theory that seems to be the overall consensus for understanding the choices here is that the 6 characters are meant to be 6 parts of a whole, that they aren't really actually distinct characters, but that they are parts of one consciousness, and that Bernard is maybe the primary consciousness because he finishes off the novel solely from his perspective in the last section, but that he has sort of envisioned these other parts of himself that encompass different parts of his personality and his experiences, and that those are his friends. By extension, that is a representation of Virginia Woolf herself and her understanding of her own consciousness, and perhaps feeling at times that she contains multitudes. I think that's a really interesting theory, and I can definitely see support for it in the text. There are moments, especially near the end, that, well, so much of the novel is examining what it means to be a person, and there's a lot of talk about identity and containing multitudes, containing multiple people within one, and trying to find that balance and how to exist as all of those people sort of wholeheartedly or fully in your life. And also throughout, there's a lot of questions of who am I from various characters. So much of this is about identity and our own conceptualization of our consciousness and who we are and what makes us who we are, I guess. As much as that's possibly what was intended, and I can understand why that's the conclusion people come to, I think for some reason, as much as they're all fictional, I find it a little sad to look back on the novel and see Ginny, Susan, Rhoda, Neville, and Louis as just facets of Bernard instead of their own full people. So my own interpretation, or at least how I want to think about it, is as 6 separate characters who have their own full lives, and that their friendship, their connection, is sort of its own consciousness. And again, bringing back ideas from Life of Chuck, this idea that in your own mind, in your own consciousness, you create your own reality, your own understanding of the world. And I think in relationship, we do the same. The person you become when you are with your friend or with multiple friends, and the dynamic that exists, and your interpretation of the world, and the way the world shifts around you, and reality feels like it expands or contracts around this sort of magic that is the spark of friendship and relationship and that dynamic. I think that is, depending on your interpretation of the world and how far you want to go down a rabbit hole of philosophizing, that I think it would be fair to imagine that in those relationships you create this new reality that just contains the 6 of them, for example. I feel like I'm not making much sense, so I apologize, but I think that there is a way to kind of marry together both the theory that they are all one consciousness, but also that they are their own individual people, by taking into account the fact that we become someone different in relation to other people, and that we can, like I was saying earlier, in reference to my husband, that in relationship, in partnership, you can become sort of a new version of yourself, but also together you kind of form this new entity, whatever it may be, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I feel like in this friendship, these 6 people together kind of do create their own consciousness, as if they are this greater entity that contains all 6 of them, but they are still their own individual people and living their own lives, So anyway, no idea if that made any sense. Imagine how hard to follow this would have been if I tried to talk about it last night instead of sleeping on it. But just so fascinating, so interesting. I think I'll wrap up spoilers there and just reiterate that I will 100% be rereading this at some point and really trying to absorb it even more, but that I was just so enamored by the gorgeous writing. It is really overwhelmingly beautiful. And I have a feeling that this is going to kind of sit in the back of my mind and kind of grow and evolve over time. And when I come back to reread it, not only because I'll be a different person, I'll be a different version of myself at a later time as we all grow and change constantly, but every other book that I read and the way that every book I read changes my brain, changes my brain chemistry, and changes how I understand the world and myself. It's going to be really interesting to reread it, both from a perspective of already knowing what happens and being able to go into it with a little more foreknowledge and a little understanding already and be able to reinterpret what I come across, but also to have a different understanding of all the ideas being presented, because I will have lived more life and grown and changed and read a bunch more books. So I'm excited for that. And if you are in the Buddy Read or the book club on Patreon and you'd be interested in reading The Waves together, let me know, because we could definitely do that. Am I still mildly baffled? Maybe more than mildly? Yes. Did I feel totally swept away by the prose? And did I become very attached to the characters despite not always knowing who was talking or what was happening? Yes. So I think this is going to be 5 stars from me. I am so intrigued to read more Virginia Woolf at this point, and I'm very glad that I decided to do this reading vlog and that I decided to choose The Waves as one of my experimental fiction picks, because not only is it a perfect pick for a video like this, it is so experimental, but also I have a feeling that this book is going to be a constant companion for me through the rest of my life. I just have an inkling that it's going to be something I come back to over and over again and really enjoy diving deep into and teasing apart. And I do think that a first experience of listening to the audiobook and just letting it wash over me, mostly sitting with my eyes closed, just listening to these soliloquies, was possibly the perfect way to listen to it. So that was The Waves by Virginia Woolf. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments if you've read it. What did you think? How did you rate it? What was your experience like? All the things. And I was going to read a third book for this video and I started it, but it's a book that I had started previously and read to about 60%, and I ended up putting it aside because I just felt like I wasn't in the right headspace and I wasn't really following. And I started it earlier today and listened to a couple chapters, and I just felt myself being totally checked out. It really wasn't holding my attention or pulling me in at all. I still felt so kind of discombobulated in the best way by The Waves. And I just think it's not really the right time for me to read it. I feel like I need to give my brain a couple days of rest or much simpler fiction, much more straightforward fiction, to fully process what I just read, because that was a lot. So I'm going to leave it there, I think. I had 2 great reading experiences, 2 5-star reads, The Life of Chuck by Stephen King and The Waves by Virginia Woolf, both experimental in different ways, but also, interestingly, kind of tapping into some similar questions and themes and ideas, and both quite character-driven and focused on consciousness and identity and existence in a really interesting way. So that was fun. I feel like they are kind of a great companion read, and I would love to hear your thoughts if you've read either of them. And also, if you have more experimental fiction recommendations for me, leave them down below. I'd love to add even more to my TBR. And thank you again to Spotify for sponsoring this video. I'm so glad to be a Spotify partner. It was awesome to get to listen to both of these audiobooks on Spotify at no added cost, just with my premium subscription. I really felt like both of these audiobooks were very well done, very well narrated, and even though both of them were strange and experimental and at times a little hard to follow, the narrators did a really great job of sort of guiding me through the experience, like someone holding your hand through something quite complicated and overwhelming, but also beautiful and worth the effort, you know? So thank you again to Spotify. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.